welcome to another edition of The Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and we continue our examination of Guyana's public policy, both the foreign policy and domestic policy. And on this occasion, we try to answer the question, why does Guyana flood? And I think it must concern everybody because we're in the middle of a flood now. As I speak, Kokwani is flooded, and several other riverine communities are subject to flooding during this May-June season. And of course, there are two rainy seasons, December, January, and May, June. So we're in the floods. When we look at the floods in Guyana, you must ask yourselves, why do we flood so frequently? And why are the floods so damaging? Every one of Guyana's 10 regions is named after a great river. All the 10 regions are named after our greatest rivers. From Region 1, the Barima-Waini, to Region 10, the Upper Demerara Berbice. And in fact, Region 10 is the only region that actually straddles the three greatest rivers, Demerara, Essequibo, and Berbice. So we could expect that there's going to be substantial flooding in Region 10 because that has got three big rivers to deal with. Most of the rivers in Guyana run from south to north. That means most of them, the major rivers, empty into the Atlantic, and therefore this creates a problem of siltation at the estuaries. So when we're looking at flooding, we're not just looking at rainfall. Rainfall is a very important factor, but we're also looking at high tides because the coast is so low that when the ocean is high, it is difficult to drain the land without artificial means like pumps. Certainly gravity drainage doesn't always work. There's also high inflow of water from the tributaries. For example, sometimes there's bright sunshine on the coastline, but Rupununi is being flooded because the tributaries, and don't forget Rupununi is part of the Amazonian system. The Cuyuni River comes from Venezuela. And the tributaries contribute to the swelling of the rivers. And of course, as I said just now, the accumulation of silt in the estuaries of the rivers. Each one of the coastal regions also has a conservancy. And of course, deforestation contributes to flooding. So there are several sources of flooding, the heavy rainfall, the high tides, the influence of the tributaries, the accumulation of silt in the estuaries, the conservancies, and deforestation. And all rivers age. Rivers are like people. They have young rivers, mature rivers, and old rivers. And sometimes when a river is young, there's a very heavy flow. But later on, the banks start to crumble, and it doesn't remove water as efficiently as in its youthful days. So sometimes they are old rivers, sometimes rivers could even disappear. And we can see that some of the rivers are not capable of removing the water, the flood water, quickly or efficiently towards the ocean. Six of our coastal regions abut the Atlantic. And the Atlantic is affected by global warming and climate change, causing rising sea levels. The annual rate of sea level on the coastline is about 10 millimeters. And that sea level rise in Guyana's coast is much beyond, it's much in excess of the global sea level rise, which is about 2.4 millimeters a year on average. And Guyana is 10 millimeters. Sea level rise near Georgetown has been about 23 centimeters in the 23 years between 1994 and 2017. So we are facing rising sea level. That is a geographical fact. You should also consider that 5 coastal regions rely on water conservancies to control floodwaters. They're very useful to farmers because they can provide water during during droughts. But during rainy season, they themselves can become a threat. In Region 2, the Pomeroon Supernam, you have the Tapakuma scheme. In Region 3, Essequibo Islands, West Demerara, you have the Borosiri scheme. Region 4, Demerara Mahaika, you have the East Demerara Water Conservancy. Region 5, in the Mahaika Borbis, you have the MMA ADA. And Region 6, East Berbice Quarantine, you have the Kanji. All these are important water control schemes, but they have a capacity. And when they are filled to capacity, they overflow. And if the rivers through which they overflow are too shallow and are not cleared, are not desilted, the water will run onto the rice field and into the farming areas. So the conservancies are useful, but in very heavy weather, such as we're having now, they could also be a threat. So when we're looking at rainfall, when we're looking at flooding, there are very many factors to consider. Sea level rise is important because the rising sea level in the Atlantic would affect drainage. And once the drainage capacity is affected, it will contribute to flooding. And as you know, on the coastland, mean sea level rise has been increasing from year to year. In fact, since the 1950s, and it is now 4 times the global average. So this is nothing to ignore. We must pay attention to global warming, climate change, and of course the effect it is having on the coastline and the rivers of Guyana. Now, Guyana has been suffering from severe flooding for over 2 decades. And what we're seeing now is not new. What is new is that we don't seem to have learned the lessons of the past, and we haven't been able to address the causes. Causation is important. And we have been witnessing extraordinary levels of rainfall up to last year, in the May-June rains of 2021. Every region, all 10 regions were affected last year. And it was described by the government itself as the worst flood in the history of Guyana. 52,000 households were affected. And this is something that we cannot sniff at. We have to pay attention to the fact that such a large part of our population, was affected by the rainy season. We can't have this sort of thing every year. Now, many of us who are old enough would remember, what happened in 2005. I call it the Demerara disaster. It was, to many persons, the worst flood that they had undergone in their life, but they didn't expect what would have happened last year. In the Demerara disaster of 2005, particularly those persons living on the east coast of Demerara in Region 4, we saw about 127.5 millimeters of rainfall within 24 hours in the capital. I can tell you that because I had to leave my little cottage there and find other accommodation. And the Hydromet Service reported that the annual rainfall in Region 1 within a 24-hour period was 138.7 millimeters. And of course, it was very high in other regions, about 100 millimeters of rain. And this is an important factor because that type of that level of flooding doesn't happen every year, but it is more likely to happen now than ever before. Last year, I called it Great Flood. You have to find names for these floods because in 2005 we had the Demerara disaster last year. Let me call it the Great Flood. Nothing great about it. It was a notorious flood. Started on the 26th of April. And the daily volume of rainfall in the May-June period was 4,318 millimeters in regions 1, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 10. And in regions 2, 4, and 9, the average rainfall is a little lower, between 762 millimeters and 1,542 millimeters. Now, during the same period, in 2015, 2020, it was much lower than that. Why are we so concerned? Because people suffer. And the people who suffer first and the people who suffer most tend to be women, tend to be housewives, because households are damaged. And they're the ones who look after the households. In the Demerara disaster of 2005, 17 years ago, some people haven't recovered as yet. There were extraordinary episodes of rainfall affecting 2/3 of the capital, Georgetown. The hinterland flooded, affecting 120,000 persons. 34 people died during the 2005 disaster. 34 people died. Some of them drowned, some of them, contracted waterborne diseases like gastroenteritis and leptospirosis. And in fact, the government was forced to declare 3 regions, the Essequibo Islands, West Demerara, the Demerara-Mahaica Region 4, and West Mahaica-Berbice, West Coast Berbice, 3, 4, and 5, were disaster areas, and 290,000 persons were affected by the floods in 2005, the Demerara disaster. But in fact, it was the West Demerara, East Demerara, and the West Berbice disaster. So flooding is something that we cannot ignore in Guyana. And in fact, it was reported that over a period between 1988 and 2006, about 965,000 persons were affected. Of course, maybe some people were affected repeatedly, but the floods in that period cost Guyana over $663 million US. We lost a significant portion, about 60% of our GDP, and at any given time, about 25% of our population was affected. Many people had to move into shelters. In fact, in the Berbice River, and if you ever study floods, go to Kokwani, because I personally saw, flood waters rise about 4.5 meters. That's about 15 feet in Kokwani. It's unbelievable. In 2011, I drove around Lethem in an outboard engine motorboat. Floods could be deadly in this country. And up to now, June 2022, people in Kokwani are still being forced to leave their houses and go into shelters. And of course, in the Kanji Creek and most of the creeks. Look at Barakara, for example. People just sat there and saw their farms, their animals, their livestock, being completely destroyed. And what assistance did they get? Some people up to now have not gotten, the so-called cash grant to reestablish their farming. Some of them got seeds. Some of them got a few, cutlasses and shovels. Other people were getting, different types of mechanical equipment, diggers. But some people were getting cutlasses, and we need to plan to ensure that people's lives in every part of the country are not severely disrupted. If you are going to provide relief grants, you also must provide a relief plan. You cannot solve floods with grants and handouts. You have to solve flooding by ensuring that there is a plan to mitigate flooding. And this would call for infrastructure and other expenditure, not stadiums. I can tell you that. Again, we need a plan because we are capable in Guyana of responding, but the international response has also been important. And that's why, in these programs, we try to deal not only domestic policy, but international policy, because we need, there's some people who criticize CARICOM, but CARICOM was the first to help Guyana back in 2005. Guyana, up to now, is not really capable of responding to the types of flooding that we get literally twice a year, because climate change is practically irreversible, and Guyana has more or less abandoned its effort to mitigate the adverse impacts of climate change. Unfortunately, from the time of the Demerara disaster in 2005, we saw billions of dollars being spent on World Cup cricket, Carry Festa, five-star hotel, other prestige projects. And we have not, over the years, despite the disasters, put into place the infrastructure which could prevent the damage and loss of life which the flooding is costing Guyana. When the APNU was in opposition, we had actually assembled a team of experts and we produced a comprehensive national flood control plan. And when we were in government, we were implementing that plan. And that plan was aimed at saving lives. That's most important, and protecting property. When we got into office, we promulgated a National Climate Change Policy and Action Plan, 2020 to 2030. And of course, you know what happened in 2020. But this plan was based on consultation, and it is not a unilateral plan. It was a plan that was based on consulting experts and civil society. The action plan is important. Of course, it's been abandoned now. It dealt with vulnerable and hinterland communities, and it projected a clear vision for responding to climate change. It gave us our objectives and principles, but unfortunately, the present administration has abandoned that, as it's abandoned everything else. That was good, that the APNU AFC coalition was attempting to do. Even the Department of the Environment, which was meant to bring together all of the agencies, climate change and EPA and all those agencies, to stop them operating in silos. Even that was miniaturized, and you can see what is happening to the environment now. That the Department of Environment, people hardly hear about that now, and we were operating in that way because the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change required different type of governmental action. It required a powerhouse. It required a ministry if we were to really overcome the adverse impacts of climate change. And that's the reason why we promulgated our Green State Development Strategy. Again, like many of the initiatives started by the coalition administration, the APNU AFC coalition administration, it was just thrown out of the window, and we could see what is happening now because of the abandonment of those sensible plans. But let's come back to CARICOM. Because there are many people in Guyana, people who should know better, who find great pleasure in criticizing CARICOM. And of course, people used to make calypsos about CARICOM, but when the Demerara disaster struck, CARICOM was out of the blocks, like a racehorse. CARICOM gave us unstinted support back in the Demerara disaster, the 2005 flood. It marshaled the efforts of and assets of some of the critical agencies, CAREC, the Caribbean Epidemiology Center, CIDERA. I think some of them have changed the names now. CIDERA used to be the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Response Agency. Now I think is Emergency Management Agency, CIDEMA. CEHI, the Caribbean Environmental Health Institute. CFNI, the Caribbean Food and Nutrition Institute. And you can see that a flood is many faceted. A flood is not, getting out there in rubber boots and handing out hampers to villagers. A flood requires a multifaceted approach, and that is why we must have a plan, which we don't have now, because people have ignored the plan that is taking place. We got advice from the Global Environmental Facility, the GEF, which proposed an international mitigation strategy. And in dealing with the floods, we need to look at using renewable energy, more solar farms, more wind farms, more hydropowered renewable energy sources. We need to look at the types of buildings that we construct, retrofitting buildings, to be more energy efficient, utilizing sustainable transport, electrical vehicles, biofuels, and of course, providing, or promoting, sustainable use of our forests, not cutting down forests, especially the mining areas, which I dealt with in a previous program. People just, dig these big holes and in the ground, and of course, there are no trees, there's no vegetation to retain the water during rainfall. It runs all the way down in the river and causes flooding downstream. So there has to be a comprehensive approach if we are going to overcome the problems of flooding. Even the Netherlands, well, of course, the Netherlands, if you know what Netherlands means, it's really the lowlands. And they are perhaps, that country is perhaps one of the most susceptible to North Sea flooding. And they have a lot of experience, and they conducted a survey to improve the drainage system here in Guyana to mitigate flood disaster in Georgetown. We got help from the World Bank, and they developed a conservancy adaptation project. We got help from UNDP, from IDB, from CDC, and all of these agencies, international agencies, responded to Guyana's requests for assistance over the years. I'm not going to make a judgment as to whether we made the best use of that advice. Certainly, I can speak for the APNU AFC coalition. And we did bring experts together and we did promulgate a plan. Right now, we proposed, in fact, before we left office, we proposed a national floodplain management system, because we need to develop a whole of country approach to mitigating the adverse effects of flooding. The National Drainage and Irrigation Authority, NDIA, is necessary, but it's not sufficient. It cannot I don't know if it comprehends the nature of flooding in the hinterland. Because, in fact, in many hinterland areas, the flooding starts, or the flooding is attributable to climate change or to the effects of factors in other countries, particularly Rupununi. Because the Amazon is the biggest river in the world, and the Amazon system actually controls the river system in Rupununi. And sometimes, as I said, the coastline is dry, but the Rupununi is flooding because of the Amazon River system. The NDIA cannot control that. So what we need is a system in which the regions, the RDCs, the NDCs, the indigenous village councils are more involved in flood prevention. And we see the need for having a national flood management system which understands climate change, and it monitors climate change, and it helps to mitigate the adverse effects of climate change. On the coast, we need to deal with coastal zone management. When you see people cutting down mangroves, they are endangering you and your livelihoods, your households, and future generations. And right now, those mangroves are being deliberately destroyed. And there's no evidence that in the areas of removal, there have been efforts at replacement. We need to look at the communication system, because when the rivers start to rise, people have to be notified to move to higher ground or to leave where they're living because they're endangered. But APNU AFC Coalition created something called the Regional Public Broadcasting Service, so that people in Karasabay, could be informed by the Rupununi system. And of course, there's a station, or there used to be a station at Lethem. There was one at Aishalton. There's another one at Anna. Rupununi is very lucky. It had three public broadcasting stations. But it means that all of the villages, through the regional public broadcasting service, could be notified of imminent disaster. And they don't have to stay until the floodwaters rise, because people say, please move, the rivers are swelling. So that communication system is also important. In other areas, we need to look at the canals, the trenches, and the waterways. These have to be continuously maintained. They mustn't become silted up either with vegetation and worse still, with garbage, which cannot dissolve. And this is something that has to be done continuously. And the local government system, NDCs, RDCs, the town councils, have to be empowered, have to be financed in order to keep those systems effective. Don't forget, even Georgetown and many of the human settlements along the coast were all sugar estates. And the sugar estates used to function because they had an efficient draining system. But when we built housing schemes, when we built towns on those very sugar estates, what happened? We filled in the trenches with concrete. We wanted good yards with concrete and so on. And of course, the water has nowhere to run, and that contributes to flooding. So what we've done, we've changed the settlement patterns on the coastline in many areas by having beautiful schemes, but by eliminating the drainage systems that work for sugar estates. Just look at what is happening on the different areas. Look at what is happening in Lusignan and East Demerara and Diamond. Those places used to be sugar plantations. And we need to look at these efforts to change settlement patterns because they will affect flooding. We need a whole of government and a whole of country approach. That is to say, floods affect every region and affect almost every ministry in the government. And we need to ensure that we have a new policy about building reservoirs, looking after canals and trenches, looking after the outfalls of rivers. And every river that runs into the Atlantic, from Kanji, Berbice, Abari, Maikoni, Mahaika, Demerara, Pomeroon, every river that runs into the Atlantic eventually will have a problem of siltation at its estuary. And we need to think about creation of artificial lakes so that the water could run into lakes. I've seen one in operation in the Rupununi, so that excess rainfall could run into those artificial lakes to contain floodwater. But most of all, we need to get the regional system, the RDCs and NDCs and the town councils on board, and we have to give them the capability to respond to flooding. We cannot do everything from Georgetown. We cannot do everything from the NDIA. And now that we know that the floods are here, and the floods will come back again in December, January, and again next year, we need to put in place a national floodplain management system. And we need to think about new pumping stations. We need to think about new canals. We need to think about maintaining, or restoring the canal system to drain our lands in order to alleviate annual flooding. My friends, these floods are not, as the saying goes, acts of God, force majeure. These floods are largely the result of human inaction, human neglect. And if we are to overcome the problem of flooding in Guyana, we need a plan. And I'm recommending to you all to be part of the National Floodplain Management System, wherever you live, in a neighborhood, in a village, in a housing scheme, if you are part of the regional democratic system, if you're part of the national system, national government. We need to have a national plan to alleviate annual flooding. Without a plan, Guyanese will be doomed to another disaster May, June 2023. We don't want that. We need to protect this land against these dangerous and damaging and deadly floods to give our children a better life in this country. Land of many waters, but We need to plan for heavy rainfall, and we need to ensure that those waters don't threaten our lives, but they serve us to produce food. And we can only do that by ensuring that we have a plan, and all Guyanese could share in that plan to make sure that we preserve this patrimony, the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. Thank you, and may God bless you.
Let us cooperate for Guyana. Let us cooperate for our land. Let us resolve to fight together. See we do it right together. Can we do it? Yes, we can.